oh, it's this YouTube thing, and then hit this, and hit auto find live sources, and then activate. And then now I have to make the poll. Please like. Made in USA, like. Made in China, like. Start poll. All right. I want to watch the. First of all. Actually, do I have that saved? Let me real quick. Get rid of some of these tabs. We never did this. Chad. Okay. Ethiopia. I feel like Ethiopia would have other stuff. Fuck. Okay. Ooh. The DRC would have other. I don't know if the DRC has coffee. I don't know Africa very well. I know it's not Cameroon because I've had Cameroon before. I'm gonna guess Rwanda. Oh fuck. Oh right. Oh, directly northeast of Rwanda. Fuck. Isn't that is it Mozambique? No, fuck. Oh man. I don't think Botswana is down too far, right? It's also not. I don't think it's west. There's a country that's like starts with an M. I don't even know if it's this one. No, it's not even the one I'm thinking of. There's a country like on that same lake or whatever that starts with an M. It's not Mauritania. Oh fuck! I don't know. Zimbabwe. It's not Zimbabwe, but I'm gonna guess Zimbabwe. Uganda. Fuck. Okay, Jubilee. Tariff debate.
But most evidence.
I gave you a hint. Oh, is that why you gay thing from Uganda? We'll read this later, I think. Okay. Let's see my what's that? I need a word like my critical support for Phil here. I need a word for like kind, like half ally, like ally ally on this one issue.
Welcome to the Variable Show. This is The Exchange. We're going to be talking about tariffs, the good, the bad, the ugly, and we have experts on both sides of the aisle. The person that is going to be debating the anti-tariff approach is Phil Magnus, an American economic historian who holds a PhD in public policy from George Mason University and currently serves as a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. He's also the author of multiple books, including The 1619 Project, a critique, and has been published in Wall Street Journal and New York Times. On the flip side, the two people that are very pro-tariff is economist Ian Fletcher, is one of America's foremost experts on the problems of free trade, and he's the co-author of the new book, Industrial Policy for the United States. He's also joined by his other co-author, Mark Fasto, who is the founder of the American Strategic Insurance Group and also a Harvard Law graduate. Phil, if you want to start, we'd love to hear a 5-minute or so just premise of your belief.
Well, they don't even know. These people aren't even. I don't think these people will even defend Trump's tariff thing, right? Like, I don't know if they're I don't know what their position is exactly, but I kind of doubt that they would defend literal 10% tariffs across the board. When was this filmed? A month ago? February 14th, so most of the insane shit hasn't happened yet.
To tariffs, as it is a big hot button right now.
Absolutely. Well, first off, thank you for having us here for this.
Are they MAGA? No, I don't think. Well, they might. I don't know for sure. Presumably they're not full on MAGA. They might. They might have voted for Trump. I don't know, but
discussion. But I guess I can start us off by saying it's been a very tumultuous about a month now that Trump's been in office, and we've gone through several iterations of tariff policy, including earlier this week he imposed 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum coming in from countries abroad. As I look to these policies, though, I am deeply skeptical about what they portend for the economic course of the Trump administration. And I say so because Trump himself does not seem to know entirely what he wants to get from tariffs.
True.
Tariffs are essentially a tax. They're written into the Constitution as a tax mechanism, but they actually serve a couple of different purposes. And in the course of just 3 weeks, Trump has tried out all three of those major purposes multiple times, often in contradictory ways. The first is protectionism, an attempt to bolster up domestic industry against its foreign competitors. And Trump does seem to believe that protection is a desirable.
International trade union lawyers should be able to talk about trade. True. No one should be allowed to talk about industrial policy. Very true. Very true. You should have a license. You should have to have a license to talk about trade on any podcast, even on Twitter, probably.
Thing, although we can debate the merits of that because it does involve giving a benefit to one industry, but also raising costs on other industries that now have to pay the tax itself or pay increased costs for the tariff good. So protectionism is one objective. Second, he's floated this idea of replacing the income tax and the IRS itself with something he calls the External Revenue Service. This is using tariffs to raise money for the federal government and pay for things the government does.
Specifically, and you have to get one in you have to specialize in international economics too. You can't just have a regular PhD in economics. You have to have a specialty in international trade.
Now, this is interesting from a historical perspective because we used to do that. From the founding era, the first Congress in 1789 up until 1913, tariffs are the dominant.
Aren't tariffs good for like things if we go to war with China? So sometimes yes. So Sample's gonna get mad at me again. There are, for example, some strategic industries like batteries, which are important for drones, which we might not want to be produced in a foreign adversary like China, right? Which wants pumps sometimes. That insane pomp letter guy, this guy, Anthony Pomp, whatever the fuck, dude, this guy's fucking insane. Or he's not like that insane. He's insane because he's not like that insane, but like somehow comes up with these like insane justifications for insane policy. It's wild. Anyway. So some things I'll say. One, tariffs usually aren't even the optimal way to do that. Like it seems like we have a lot of evidence that like tariffs just kind of are bad because they end up like protecting like very inefficient industries. So even if you protect the battery industry in the U.S. with tariffs, you're gonna end up having like a very unproductive, expensive, inefficient battery industry. And it should probably be, if you actually want battery industry here, you should probably combine it with like subsidies and other incentives to have battery production here. But I will also mention like the more countries you tariff and the more shit you tariff, the more you undermine that. For example, if you tariff batteries, but also tariff everything needed to make the battery factories, you end up undermining the ability for strategic industries to thrive in the U.S. What game is this? This game is called Theotown. Basically, for example, semiconductors is a strategic industry. And they're hurt by the tariffs because they rely on equipment from the Netherlands, equipment that is really only made in the Netherlands. And if you tariff that equipment, they might just not be able to fucking afford it. So semiconductors aren't going to be built in the U.S. because they can't afford the inputs necessary to build their fucking factory.
Dominant mechanism that funds the federal government. But this comes with a couple caveats. First off, they don't raise nearly as much money as income taxes. And the second, that objective of raising money.
But anyway, like this guy, like this probably is like a pretty reasonable article. Like this guy's actually looking at data and things like this. Like this seems reasonable, mostly. But then this guy also has tweets and he's like, tariffs are going to lead to deflation and a balanced budget and the best U.S. economy. It's like, dog, like how are you like this insane? Like literally, this guy somewhere, I could probably find it, has a tweet saying tariffs are both going to lead to prices coming down and a balanced budget, which is fucking absurd because tariffs increase prices. And even if they did decrease prices, deflation makes it harder to pay off debt. Deflation increases the real value, increases the real interest rate, increases the value of money, and therefore makes it harder to pay off your debt, which is denominated nominally. Your debt is in nominal dollars. Yeah.
Off of tariffs is in tension with, in fact, it's at odds with the objective
like
of
only tariffing China instead of all countries would be not retarded. I mean, I still think tariffs are bad on China. They still are going to have pretty negative effects. There might, again, I'll grant that there are some national security things like batteries that we might tariff from China. But again, I don't even think tariffs are like the optimal way to do that. And by tariffing, every other country, you're undermining it. Because again, maybe it doesn't matter if battery production is in South Korea because South Korea is our ally and we still benefit from trade with South Korea. If you tariff both China and South Korea, well, now production is not going to move to South Korea because they're tariffed too.
Protecting industries. Because if you protect an industry, you actually are deferring.
What do you mean if bond yields increase? Like did they did for the past few days, people selling bonds? Basically, yeah. I'm not like a huge finance guy, but basically the concerning thing is that typically in a stock market crash, people are going to go to safer assets like bonds. What that's going to do is that's going to drive up the price of bonds because there's increased demand for bonds. And that makes their yield go down because the bonds pay out like a fixed interest rate. So if the price of bonds go up, basically the profit on them that you can earn on them goes down. What's concerning is that the stock market is crashing and at the same time bonds are falling because it seems like people are kind of just dumping their dollars. They don't want to be invested in the U.S. anymore. They want to go to Japan because the U.S. or they want to go to Japan. They want to go to emerging Asian markets. They want to go to Europe because the U.S. is being run by a fucking madman. That's the concerning thing. So if I bought bonds, I would have made money. Kinda. So again, bonds pay out the fixed interest rate. So if the yield goes up, if you already own the bond, that doesn't necessarily affect. I mean, you can sell the bond for more now, but doesn't pay out, doesn't actually change the interest on the bond that you receive.
Purchases of imports to the domestic seller of the same good. On the other hand, if you want to raise revenue from taxes, you actually need those imports to cross the border so you can slap a tax on them and get some intake to the government. So we have this great tension coming out. If Trump tweets on one day he wants protection and the next day he wants revenue, I'd say to him, pick which one of the two you want because you can't have both. And then the third thing he does is he says tariffs are a negotiating bluff, a tool to try to get other countries to come on board with objectives that he wants. And he's floated things, everything from enforcement of drug traffic, crossing the borders, the fentanyl crisis, to he wants other countries to pay more of their defense share and joint allied operations and things like NATO. And he's saying that we're going to threaten tariffs, essentially, to bring that about. But again, the negotiating bluff is at odds with those other two goals because the whole point of the bluff is you use it as a tool to get the other country to do something, and then you withdraw from that tool and end up actually not getting tariffs. And that's what he attempted to do a couple weeks ago when he threatened Canada and Mexico with 25% across the board tariffs as a negotiating bluff. And then he says he got a deal. It's actually acquiescence to commitments that both of those countries had made in the previous year to the Biden administration and had made previously to Trump in his first term. But nonetheless, he used this argument of the bluff. So my point to this is, Mr. President, you need to pick one of the three things as your main policy objective, and then we can actually discuss the pros and cons, the trade-offs between them. Now, I'd say there's also an added harm in here, and that is the chaos factor. Every time Trump changes between one of these three objectives for tariffs, the stock market crashes, cryptocurrency goes crazy, supply chains and orders for goods that are dependent on raw materials, for example, that are crossing border, get paused or disrupted until that particular tariff is actually resolved.
Yep.
And every time
we have empirical evidence that uncertainty is bad for business. I mean, logically, it makes sense. No one should really be disputing that uncertainty is bad, but we have empirical studies around it.
Does this, it breeds further uncertainty in the markets. Well, uncertainty is not good for long-term economic growth. Now, we actually did get a tariff put in place earlier this week.
Not even good. It's not good for us. It's probably worse short-term than it is for long-term, really. But
this was the steel and aluminum tariff. And he said he ostensibly was doing this to target China's aggressive movements in these two markets. And China is a major producer of steel and aluminum. These are seen as geopolitical economic events. But actually, if you look at the current trade volume of the United States, where are we
in China? I mean, there is probably uncertainty in China, but it's not necessarily... it's not self-induced uncertainty.
importing steel and aluminum from, it's not China. China, in fact, is number 10 on the list of steel importers into the United States, behind such places as the Netherlands. Most of our steel actually comes from Canada and Mexico. So the incurred cost of this tariff is actually on two friendly neighbors, not this adversary across the seas. So again, I'd ask President Trump, what are the objectives here in picking a trade war with two friendly countries that seem to be economically integrated into the U.S. economy, including under a trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated in his first term as president? Why are we disrupting that? We already see some of the repercussions, because when you do put tariffs on goods from abroad, that actually instigates other countries to retaliate against the United States itself, to target our exports to the rest of the world. So this raises the second question here. If tariffs are disrupting markets internally with increased costs and uncertainty and potential supply chain pauses and disruptions, what are they also doing abroad? If other countries retaliate against us and target our exports, then this original stated goal...
This fucking tower is not worth it. I didn't realize how expensive it was. There's no reason to take out a loan to build this fucking shit anyway.
...of rebalancing trade in America's favor actually goes out the window, because foreign countries are targeting U.S. goods with their own retaliatory tariffs. This in turn hurts our own export market. That's essentially where I would summarize.
And again, I mean, there are other reasons that tariffs hurt exports as well, like exchange rate appreciation, and you just changed the relative profitability of industries. So
the current state of affairs. So I guess we can turn it over and go
and before we turn it over to Ian, I cannot wait to hear just your State of the Union kind of deal on this. The big talking point when it comes to tariffs is that you're passing on the tax to the consumer. And it makes things more expensive and inflation increases. Is that, I know I'm oversimplifying that, but is that, would you agree with that mentality of like tariffs? Trump is saying that tariffs are going to raise money for the government.
Too much pollution. What is even polluting over here?
And potentially floating the fact that we don't have to pay income tax, which gets the base excited. Right. But at the end of the day, would you say from an economic standpoint, it increases expenses on, it's like a tax, and technically it's a tax on the people that potentially could afford it the least? Is that
a tariff at its base is a tax. That means somebody has to pay it. And economists refer to this as tax incidence. Who incurs the burden of it? And it's not always the directly taxed firm, because if you're a seller and you have the ability to do so, you pass it on through cost to other sellers down the line, who eventually pass it on to consumers. So that's basically correct.
Ian, I'm going to hand it over to you. And we went 8 minutes on this end. And so feel free to State of the Union. And then Mark, if you have things after Ian is done.
What if they increase taxes and people buy less? Will the company consume it? I'm confused what you're saying. What if they increase taxes on who? Will people buy less? Will
a follow-up question as well. So
take 5 minutes and I'll take
prices.
Okay, Ian, it's all you.
Hi, my name is Ian Fletcher, and I'm a member of the advisory board of an organization called the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is a nationwide...
No, shut the God. Wait, hold on. Hold on. No, thanks, fucking Google. Hold on. If oh, sorry, I thought it said Jerry Ferry. If Jeff Ferry, is Jeff Ferry on this thing? Okay, no. I wonder what this guy has written. Maybe this organization has some good stuff. This quote unquote like model, saying that tariffs would raise income is like actually like bad faith, like level of bad. Like it just makes openly like false assumptions that like tariffs aren't going to devote resources away from other sectors and towards protected sectors. It's just like tariffs are actually going to just make resources come out of nowhere, and there'll be a bunch more investment than there would have been otherwise. And they also say that tariffs are going to increase productivity when all the evidence says otherwise. So it's just like, if I make like two obviously false bad faith assumptions, then yeah, tariffs are good. That's crazy. If I just assume tariffs have no cost, then they have no cost. But this organization is insane.
Tariff Group, and you can find us at prosperousamerica.org. I'm also the author of this book, which came out originally in 2010, Free Trade Doesn't Work. True. And so I think I can fairly claim just a little bit of prescience as to what's happened in the last 13 years, because I did predict that free trade wouldn't last. And it was
not fun. We supported a welfare state at least 5 times a day. I don't think I have yet. I need to. What's up, Econo Boy?
Going to blow up into a giant set of controversies. Now, in terms of what Phil said, I want to begin by saying that the three-way trilemma you announced is you can't have tariffs for revenue and protection and political leverage. I'm afraid tariffs have been used for all three simultaneously for as far back as the records go, which is about 500 years. You are correct that sometimes these purposes can run into contradiction. Yes, they can. That's true of a lot of foreign policy issues. But the idea that you have to pick...
Non-Fun is a capitalist? I am, in fact, a capitalist. Like, Believe it or not. Believe it or not.
One, it may make a good soundbite. It's not true. Now, second point I'd like to make is,
Does like
I
the
mentioned
poor.
economic
I love
history.
the poor.
Economic history, if you want to understand all this stuff, is your friend. Because theoretical economics, which you mostly get spooned out in economics departments and the people who quote them, like the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, they're going to tell you free trade, free trade, free trade. According to their model of the world, free trade was the best thing. It was good for us even if we didn't think it was. It was going to lead to balanced trade. It was going to lead to prosperity. It was going to...
I don't know. I mean, some like models, I guess, would imply, I think, do typically imply balanced trade, but there's plenty of Econ 101 reasons why trade deficits aren't bad and things. 500 years of tariff, let's go.
all these wonderful things which it hasn't done. So if you want to understand the real economics of this, turn to economic history. Particularly, you can look at America's own history because we were a tariff-protected country right from when we...
Oh, no. This is the exact wrong person to bring it up to. The Phil guy has actually done, like, actual research on this. Like, I'm pretty sure he has a paper. I think I have two papers on it saved. He is the author of one of them. It's either the Did Tariffs Make Manufacturing Great? It's either... It might be this paper? No, it's not this paper. Somewhere else there's another one that he is actually an author of about tariffs in like the 1860s and whether or not they actually
started out as an agricultural...
His conclusion is no, by the way, believe it or not. I think it's probably in...
Banana Republic, and eventually became the greatest economic power the world had ever seen. Now, the next thing I want to tell everyone is you have to understand that tariffs are not an ideology. It's not like tariffs are either good or bad, and if you're in favor of tariffs, you're in favor of all tariffs everywhere, of whatever amount, whatever industry, whatever country, or the opposite. Tariffs are a policy tool. So Phil is absolutely right that some people, possibly including the president, would like to think that tariffs on their own can accomplish all sorts of desirable objectives that in fact they can't do. And that is absolutely true, and neither I nor my co-author would deny it, and it's not what we said in the book that we just finished writing. Tariffs are one policy tool out of about 2 or 3 dozen policy tools that form the larger constellation of what we call industrial policy, which means policies based on the idea it matters what industries a country has, and the economics of one industry, from an analytical point of view, can be different from the economics of another industry. So, in terms of Phil's point that tariffs on their own will not bring about balanced trade, that's pretty much what we say in the book. We say tariffs are a legitimate tool, but if you really want to balance America's trade, you need to bring down the overvalued dollar, because if you have a tariff of 15%, and then the dollar is overvalued by the best estimate we recently made was 16%, well, then your dollar overvaluation more than...
16? I feel like there's no way it's 16%. Maybe I should... There's probably other papers that I can look at to try to see it. But I don't know. Like, I'm not convinced that... I'm still looking for my other shit. I'm not convinced that the dollar is really that overvalued just because of its reserve currency status. Like, if you look at... I don't know. Like, if you look at the actual... This orange bar here is like the reserve assets that other countries are holding so they can peg their exchange rates or whatever. And it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. We're just like a much better place to invest in generally. That's probably a bigger reason for the trade deficit than the overvalued dollar.
Then cancels out your tariff. So if you bring the dollar down, you'll bring your imports down. And then the bonus of dealing with the dollar rather than tariffs is it also makes your exports go up because it makes your exports more competitive internationally. So if tariffs can't do that, what are they good for?
Fuck, it's not these. I don't know, but these are 3 other studies that show, the tariffs in the 1800s were not responsible for American growth or in that sector. And I think one of them actually says it was just because we started using capital goods a lot more efficiently, and we actually would have had higher growth without the tariffs because we would have been able to import more capital goods if we didn't have the tariffs in place.
Well, what tariffs have that currency and other measures don't is tariffs are industry specific. For example, one of the last things Biden did on his way out was to preemptively impose a prohibitive 100% tariff on imports of Chinese electric cars. Now, we think that was a good thing. Why? Because electric cars are the future. So if America does not have an electric car industry of its own, it's not going to have a car industry at all. And if you don't have a car industry at all, not only do you have the employment issues and the suppliers and the bankruptcies and the communities that are destroyed, you also have a gigantic national security problem because you won't have the industrial base for building the mechanized equipment that you need to win wars. The U.S., since about 1990, has gotten real lazy about its security. You can't defend your country with websites and leverage buyouts on Wall Street. You can only defend your country with pieces of machinery that are usually made of steel or aluminum, and they're packed with electronics, and they have an energy source. So the national security issues alone basically mandate that the United States maintain a first-class industrial base. That is to say, an industrial base.
Does it? Oh, do we really need? First of all, I don't know. I would hope Phil would at least get the concession that, like, we recognize that because of how much more productive we've gotten, the actual employment situation when it comes to manufacturing is not going to be helped that much, even if we do develop this industrial base. Like, you're probably never getting back to that, 30% manufacturing share of employment that we had in the 60s or whatever, just because we're so much more productive. I feel like Krugman had an estimate of how much it would be, but it was like, it's pretty low, even if you like entirely get rid of the trade deficit, how much the share of employment actually goes up. I would hope he at least get that concession. I'm really curious what the rest of the national security things that he'll say. Just not at all convinced. And also, we have plenty of allies that are like Germany has a relatively like decent industrial base. Like South Korea like does too. Like, why are we I don't know. Again, I don't know if they strictly defend Trump's tariff policy. Why are we tariffing these fucking people like dog? What's up, Rip Haven? Welcome back. We're just reacting to this tariff debate.
It has capabilities equal to anyone else in the world. Yep. Anything they can build, we can build, and we can build it at scale. So it's not just a one-off customized hot rod, but you can do what we did in World War II, where we had giant factories that were producing more aircraft, more tanks, more everything than the other side. And a lot of people will tell you that if you want thriving industries, free markets are your best bet. Well, that's just not empirically what we have seen under free trade. We've been deindustrializing at a rapid pace. And the final point I'm going to make
and again, entirely convinced that's true. Is like the fifth time I'm going to go on this fucking spiel or whatever. But I'm not convinced trade is the reason we've deindustrialized, and I'm not convinced deindustrialization is as big a deal as people think it is. Because again, like real manufacturing output was going up all the way until 2008, and real manufacturing value added is still going up. So
when we say free trade, it means free trade for America. It means our border is open to the passage of goods. It does not mean other countries are also free, regardless of what agreements they may sign at the WTO. There's a short list of other countries that have real-ish free trade, the UK, Australia, a few others. When you're dealing with
like
China, they're blatantly and criminally dishonest about violating it. When you're dealing with Japan and Korea, they're not criminal, they're generally not blatant, but they're very, very sneaky about dishonoring the free trade agreement. And when you're dealing with the Europeans, they do the same thing in an exquisitely polite, politically correct way, but we call that mercantilism.
Okay, can I step in here?
Yeah, Mark, Ian left you 5 seconds, so maybe, but I'll let you make a quick summary. Yeah.
Okay, let me talk about tariffs with more specificity. Okay, let's take the Trump steel tariffs. Okay, everybody, usual free traders had their hair on fire, that terrible price increases and so on. So what actually happened? The price did tick up a little bit when the tariffs were first put on. A year later, what do we have? There's a 2.4% one-time price increase in the price of steel. There's $16 billion of investment in new steel plant, most of it greenfield, most of highly modern, efficient facilities, and you have more good-paying jobs. So,
what? Why did he do? There's no. He knows. This guy knows. This guy knows that it was actually a net job loss. This guy knows that. This guy knows that. I don't know why he's even bringing that up. But okay, Jesus. Yeah, it's obviously a net job loss because there's like 80 steel consuming jobs for every one steel producing job. So you hurt 80 other jobs. And then also, the steel tariffs didn't even in the long run increase steel output because, again, people started substituting away from steel seemingly. I think I have maybe something on here somewhere. I haven't read this yet. But like, steel tariffs, I think, increased in the short term, but then people started like substituting away from steel. Like if you look at steel production, this is the steel tariffs. You can see like short term spike, but then like I don't know, some of that decline and stuff is going to be due to COVID, but
that's the actual fact. That's what happened. Now, why did it happen that way? Why? The problem with the predictions that are made about what tariffs are going to do and all the horrible things that are going to happen is that they ignore a number of, it's a static prediction. They're static predictions. It doesn't take into account the investment inducing effect of tariffs. Something similar happened with the washing machine tariffs. Also, prices went up, more investment came in, there was domestic.
I don't know why he thinks anyone would deny it. That's the whole point, is that you increase prices so that people have an incentive to invest. You increase the relative profitability of that industry so as to shift investment away from the other sectors that you have now made relatively less profitable.
Competition, prices came back down, and there were more good manufacturing jobs in the United States. So they also...
Again, the steel tariff specifically led to a net job loss even within manufacturing, but...
that they're going to have such an awful effect on the U.S. economy also assume that tariff revenue is going to be sequestered, that they're not going to be turned back into the economy one way or another through tax breaks or government.
You don't have to make that assumption. Even with the even with the tax revenue, there's still deadweight loss. Also, why is everyone fucking dying?
Spending, and there are 3 or 4 other assumptions that are built into all these doomsday models. Now, as Ian said, not everything should
unlike the assumptions that these people make with the pro-tariff side, right? Those are all super solid, and that's why the Coalition for the Prosperous America is taken very seriously by all these economists, right? It's not like you guys made 20 different... Actually, I don't know if this guy works there, but if this was the one that works there, but they made like 10 different false assumptions in that one fucking paper.
The most efficient tariffs are those that are put on industries that are what we call advantageous, that can make more investment, absorb more investment productively, or on the leading edge of technology, or important for the future.
Okay, so in summary, you would just say that just like I summarized for Phil, tariffs from a standpoint potentially increase for consumers. You would say that it increases jobs in the United States, and it doesn't increase the price dollar for dollar for the tariff.
It's definitely not dollar for dollar. It's definitely not dollar for dollar, because the exporters eat some of it. But yes, it's.
I mean, that's true, but usually the exporters eat like, maybe 5-10% of it. Usually the pass-through rate is pretty high. This is not good.
Designed to be a tax, as Phil said, on the purchases of these imported goods. If it doesn't, as Phil also said, if you just use it for revenue, you're not achieving the fundamental purpose of the tariff.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to get into, I'm going to talk about some current events, and then I'm hoping we can have a great discussion this next hour. The question I have for you is, if you could wave a magic wand when it comes to tariffs, what would you do? Would it be 25% across the board? Like what type of, and if you could answer this quickly, I just want to know where your thoughts are, because I don't hear too many people wanting the US dollar to be lower. And like, that's not a talking point that I don't think Trump would run on. So what would you say?
That's in his memorandum, his America First trade memorandum. He does talk about getting the dollar down to a level which balances trade. So that is.
I don't know. In his America First memorandum, in his policy platform, literally, I remember this because it's so funny that he has like 2 very contradictory things in this platform where like, it was like number 5, keep the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And by the way, Trump has openly threatened to tariff countries. Trump has openly threatened to tariff countries who move away from the US dollar. And like number 13 on his policy platform was like, I wrote a blog post about this. Was like, keep America the world manufacturing hub. Mr. Trump's 5th core promise to stop outsourcing and his 13th core promise to keep the U.S. dollar as the world reserve currency.
Yeah, but to answer your question, the most efficient
Trump
tariffs
literally said he wanted a weaker dollar. Wait, I don't know if Trump himself openly says that he wants a weaker dollar. Some of his advisors have said that.
Our point of view are those that protect what we call advantageous industries that need the protection.
Okay.
So those are, they either employ a lot of people at decent wages, or are in industries which are the future. They're high value now. They pay a good job.
Are you talking like electric cars would be an example of that?
Yeah, cars are mid-tech, electric or high-tech.
So with that point, I would love to send this over to Phil and just ask you just to respond to that. What is an ideal tariff? What percentage?
Well, I'm a free trader, so I'd say zero to go on the complete other end of it. This could give us some fun debate. But you look into this, and I realize the arguments are made that strategic industries are beneficiaries of protection or should be targeted. I pose two questions. First is, who picks the strategic industry? I think both of y'all have said electric cars are the future. Who decided electric cars are the future? In fact, if we look at market tests right now, the vast majority of cars on the roads are traditional internal combustion engines. They seem to be far more popular. Yes, there is a market for electric vehicles, but it tends to be oriented around the cities. And you actually see this in the rental car industry. People overwhelmingly prefer gas vehicles. You can get a steep discount for a Tesla if you go to almost any airport rental car agency in the country because nobody wants them. That they have limitations on their range and all sorts of features of it. So I even question this very.
Yeah, I think Besset and I know that I always get confused. The Stephen Myron, one of those two, whichever one is to trade one, and wrote a user's guide to restructuring the global trading system. He openly wants a weaker dollar. Now, he won't actually openly say that he doesn't want the dollar to be the world reserve currency, again, because that would contradict Trump, but he has said he wants a weaker dollar.
Premise, what makes electric cars the industry of the future that we should pick as a winner through government policy?
Are you a climate change denier?
Yeah, let Bill talk about a second, and then we'll let you guys respond to that.
Yeah.
Second thing.
So the second component I'd ask, yes, a tariff absolutely does deliver a benefit to that protected strategic industry. If we put a tariff on steel, the steel industry loves it. They get to charge higher prices for their goods. It's great if you're in the steel industry because you are a beneficiary of that protective rent that's delivered over by the mechanism. But actually, who pays the cost? Well, if it's spread out to consumers
go down. He did also say yields would go down. He did say that was the big goal.
The country, it may not be dollar for dollar, but we should also ask the question, how do we weigh the costs and benefits? And it turns out most evidence of this, the aggregate costs of the tariff that's imposed spread out across 330 million consumers in aggregate is larger than the benefit that's delivered to a couple thousand or maybe 10,000 people working in the steel industry that are specific beneficiaries of this. So we actually have to ask the question, are we picking an industry as a winner here because we think it's strategic and yet spreading the cost of that on a far greater number of people? What's the net here? Are we actually benefiting the country because we picked that one industry?
Well, the models that produce those results are the same GDAP models that have been used for decades. Their predictions have been uniformly wrong because they ignore the long-term beneficial effects of increased investment, increased production that reverberate through the economy. And it's not just the steel producers that benefit from increased investment. The whole economy, you know how the effects ripple out to the rest of the economy. And the fact that they also assume that the tariffs are all absorbed by purchasers, and they're not. So the other part of your thing is, okay, if we don't pick what industries we consider advantageous and strategic, we're letting the Chinese decide for us. Because they will subsidize whatever they think industries they want to dominate, to the point if we don't protect ourselves from them, in the long term, we're a colony.
Game.
And they're doing all the high-tech, expensive, high-value stuff because they subsidize the hell out of it. Your argument assumes that that a free market is the way everybody operates, and all these choices are made by a free market. But if you look at a list of the most important innovations of the 20th century, they're all funded initially by the government, not often supporting it in a particular company, but supporting a portfolio of different approaches to a problem or a technology that's recognized as having great potential benefit, and which has turned out. Everything in the iPhone, every technology in the iPhone was funded initially by the U.S. government.
It's funny he's making the same point that I mean, I'm not saying it's untrue. I don't know for certain how true or untrue it is. It's just funny that he's making literally the exact same points that socialists do when it comes to public investment and everything.
So the idea that these things you could just leave it entirely to the free market doesn't fund breakthrough technology until it gets to the point.
You're saying that the government creates innovation? Most of the innovation that we have today is that the U.S. government invests in.
To a certain,
I don't know if I agree with that, but I
up to the point where it becomes ready for the U.S. for the private sector's investment horizons and investment and risk tolerance.
Okay.
That's when the private sector steps in. If you don't have those prior steps, those big breakthrough things don't happen.
Okay, Phil, what would be your response to that?
Well, I think we can look to history here. I mean, certainly government has a distortive effect when it invests in one specific industry. Certain yields come out of that. But the question we need to ask is what is missed in the process here? What doesn't occur because the government is taxing one group of people to support a specific targeted industry? And there are innovations that never happened because that money was diverted elsewhere in the economy. We look to the late 19th century, which is often cited as this high watermark of tariff protectionism, and in some degrees it is in the United States. And the claim is made that tariff protectionism coincided with an era of industrial growth, and to some degree, yes, it did. But actually, if you look at the different products, those that are tariffed and those that are not tariffed, it turns out that there's a faster growth rate in things like utilities and electrification mitigation compared to something like steel, which is historically one of the major products that we have put heavy protection on. So you have like a natural experiment that's actually playing out in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of the most innovative industries happen to be those that are most insulated from the tariff system that is claimed to be this mechanism that brought us prosperity in that era. So I think there's actually a lot more complexity that's going on here besides the notion that saying, hey, we just turn things over to a government bureau and it picks the right product to invest in the future. China does it that way, yes, but China also has economic problems right now. They publicly report massive GDP growth. If you ask any economist who studies China and looks at indirect indicators, they're probably fibbing about their numbers, adding 3 or 4 percentage points on top of the actual number of GDP returns in a given year. So yes, we can take the government bravado that's coming out of China, or we can take economic reality and compare it to what we actually see on the ground. And I think there are 2 very different stories here that get back to this pretense, the notion that the government can possesses the knowledge to know what innovation is going to be in the next century. And I'm actually just very skeptical.
I mean, I don't mistake me for industrial policy defender, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's fair to say the government, I mean, can at least make reasonable assumptions about what industries will be relevant in the future. Like, it seems perfectly reasonable to believe that electric cars will eventually, I can get a missile silent anyway. Will eventually be, the main car type of cars on the road. But
yeah, and I'm gonna ask a question, but then I want to go to Ian for hear your response. I would love examples if you're like, this is an example of where the tariff happened and this is why we're better off from Americans, because I'm looking at this conversation to be like, I want America to thrive and I want my family to thrive, and we'll thrive if America thrives. So that's like that could be a faulty thesis, and you can tell me if that's wrong. The other question I have that I want to go to in a second is tax credits and tax incentives. They feel like a similar area of like we incentivize things that we have, and I don't necessarily think that's necessarily a negative thing. We want to incentivize people to have kids. We're going to give a credit. We want to incentivize people. So is that different, or is that the same thing? And that's going to be like another conversation around this idea. But before that, Ian, I'm curious from your point of view. Is there any talking points that you have? Any responses?
Yeah,
examples.
I could critique a dozen things that Phil said, but just as an example of dubious logic, looking at different industry growth rates is not an apples-to-apples comparison, because industries grow at different rates for a vast number of reasons: speed of customer adoption,
yeah, I bet they
evolution
did not
of technology,
that in the study.
alternatives in the marketplace, and so forth. So you can't just say this industry grew faster without protection than this industry that had protection, therefore it's a bad policy. Now, the more important issue I want to address is Phil loves to bring up something that we hear from free trade anti-industrial policy critics all the time, which is the accusation that we propose to have the government, quote, pick winners, okay? We don't. Or there might be a very, very small number of exceptions, but 99% of the time, we're not in favor of the government doing anything that picks any particular company.
Or R&D spending has positive externalities, true, and high returns on investment, even if without certainty about which investment optimal, nothing about planning, true. I mean, yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, it does seem like government research tends to have relatively positive, like, spillover benefits and everything.
For people to make a profit. Picking industries and picking technologies is not the same as saying, okay, Ford, you're going to be the producer of tractors in the United States, and because we've said so, this is what's going to happen. Totally different thing. If you're asking which industries are important, it's not actually a big secret. There's not all that much controversy globally about which industries are significant, which technologies have promise is a bit more controversial, but as Mark said, you have a portfolio approach. Now, I freely admit that I'm operating here on the premise that climate change is real, and yes, electric cars therefore will be the future, but that's a discussion for another time. Picking technologies is not picking winners. Picking industries is not picking winners. And it's not some super subtle rocket science. Everybody can see what it is you've got to have a strong position in.
Ian, do you have an example that we can look at history and say that including government tariffs improved Americans?
Sure.
Or America revenue,
Sure. Base launch. One of the things that free traders and opponents of industrial policy will always tell you is that you can't have America first sourcing. You have to be able to source all your components from around the world. Otherwise, you won't get the best at a competitive price. 4 reasons having to do with the fact that a rocket that launches satellites is so similar to a rocket that launches nuclear weapons. America's rocket industry, by which I mean SpaceX, Blue Origin, the whole thing, has been rigorously screened for decades against having components from China, Russia, and other adversaries. It is even more rigorous than a commercial tariff.
I mean, again, like, I don't even know if Phil here would deny that there is probably a national security component to that, but the problem with the debate is that it's not a yes or no issue. The real debate is whether it makes sense to tariff your allies across the board, I'm very curious. Like, I don't think, I wish this guy would the moderator just kind of just ask, like, so do you think Donald Trump is, like, in the right here, or do you think he's still mistaken? Although I mean, it does seem like they are basically tacitly defending him because they didn't really, none of them like rejected it after Phil like explained, why he doesn't support Trump's policy or anything. But they could have clarified, like, hey, I'm not defending this, by the way. But
because you have all the tough security agencies of the U.S. government involved in it. And what have we seen as a result? Oh, we've also had massive government investment in the spaceflight industry, everything going back to the start of the space age and the first rockets which were launched by the government. What do we have now? We have a U.S. space industry which literally has no peer abroad. There is no company in China remotely comparable to SpaceX. Nobody has reusable rockets. Nobody has a cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit comparable to what they do. We not only have, under a protectionist industrial policy industry, we not only have the best in the world, we have the cheapest in the world. And we can keep it that way. That's a classic counterexample to the idea that government is only ever this bumbling, corrupt nuisance that screws things up.
And you would say Elon Musk wouldn't be able to do SpaceX because of he's off the shoulders of all the investment that the U.S. has done in NASA. But you could also look at it and say, well, Elon is outperforming government agencies because he's being a lot more efficient.
You can't because
Okay.
you said it first, right? The first way you said it, which is he stood on the shoulders of work that the government had done. And that's an example of what I talked about earlier. Government needs to invest and do the initial research and development of the technology to the point where the private sector risk tolerance and investment and how long they can wait for investment to pay off. When it enters that world, that's when government should no longer be in it. And that's
Okay,
what
Phil, I'm gonna hand it over to you to address that, and then I'm gonna then ask about the 25% aluminum tariff and your guys' thoughts on that. So, but Phil, your response.
Well, I think so. You cite something like the space industry, and I'd point out two factors of it. First off, it's not representative of the typical sector of the economy in which tariffs are applied. Space industry is very particular to both military applications and high-tech commercial applications. The second thing I'd point out about it, you're citing the space industry as this example of supposed benefits of protection, although the policies you're citing in particular on that really actually pertain to sensitive technologies and security around them. The space industry itself grew up in the era of the greatest trade liberalization in American history, the post-World War II period. Between 1945 and really the 2010s, we've had an overall downward trajectory in average tariff rates and a trend toward worldwide global tariff liberalization. Now, yes, we can say that maybe there are some arguments that certain components of sensitive technology, nuclear missiles, things like that, should absolutely be scrutinized and placed under different regulatory systems than, say, steel or clothing or backpacks or automobiles that are coming across the border. But you can't really point to this very strange, unique, exceptional industry as a justification for tariffs across the board. Now, you do note that you say that you aren't picking winners and losers. So the question I pose there, if that's the case, how come every time a tariff is proposed as policy, all of the industries in the beneficiary sector descend on Washington, D.C., open their checkbooks, and start writing checks to congressmen as campaign contributions in order to secure that favorable tariff? It sure seems like they're viewing the policy as picking them as a winner, and it certainly seems like other people that are harmed by the tariff. So, for example, we take steel. The steel industry will lobby in favor of tariffs for itself and spend campaign contributions and lobbying expenses in order to secure them. But steel is also an input to the automobile industry, and whenever a steel tariff is threatened, what does the U.S. domestic automobile industry do? They also descend on Washington, D.C. and lobby in the other direction.
Too, probably lobby.
Why? Because they're going to be excluded. If you pick steel as a raw input as a winner, they're going to actually have to incur some of the costs of that tariff, and it's in their interest to lobby against it. So every decision you make is allocating resources one way or another through the political system, and just by the very practice of doing that, you're opening up the decision-making process to being lobbied, to being campaigned for, and that's when the winners and losers actually enter into the equation.
So let's take your example. The steel cost in a car's average is $200. So, and the steel prices went up about 2.4%. So what is that, $8? Okay.
Fair enough. $8 spread across every single car in America. That's a lot of cars. And Detroit certainly wasn't happy about it.
But you had, they always squawk, but they're not too upset about it.
Okay, so why are they the losers and the steel industry is the winner, though?
Because there are going to be more people with better incomes who will be able to buy more and more expensive cars if you protect and allow these industries to thrive instead of losing them to China, where people...
Steel industry employs a couple, maybe 10, 15,000 people. 300 million people have cars.
This is an example.
I don't know. It like it's a net job loss. I don't know why. I don't know why he keeps saying we're gonna have more people with these higher income jobs, but again, it seems like we have reason to believe that it's going to be a net job loss and also probably decrease wages in other sectors. I mean, I could see, because wages are sticky. I mean, like maybe it doesn't decrease wages it's so much in other sectors as it decreases like wage growth in other sectors, but still, like you're probably not gonna. Seems like overall in aggregate, scary word, guys. Aggregate, you're gonna have less people making higher incomes. Like,
what's the trade-off here?
The trade-off is that you're producing long-term investment and long-term growth, which reverberates through the whole economy. A tariff on steel is not a whole industrial
So
policy.
why not invest that in cars in Detroit? Why not invest that in the manufacturers that use steel as an input?
Well, they should be tariffed. The downstream products that use steel should also be tariffed, so that the U.S. manufacturers that use steel as an input aren't disadvantaged.
Wait, what are we not going to tariff in this?
Imports that are made from cheaper steel abroad. So that was a failure of the initial Trump tariffs, but they did fix that. They did move the tariffs down the chain of users.
So tariffs on everything until you hit where? The consumer?
No, tariffs on every industry that is being threatened that you want to sustain or rebuild or create.
Which is tariff on every industry that is threatened. Which, by the way, this guy, what industry are you going to say that isn't threatened by China? Although I guess that also you want to protect, but this guy seems to want to protect a lot of industries.
Again, decided by politicians who are making international decisions.
Politicians make.
We're back to the same point.
But if we don't decide which industries, China will decide. You keep assuming there's a background here. Your comments are made all against a background, which assumes there are no.
How much steel do we import from China right now? It's a negligible amount compared to our major trading partners. It has been basically since China entered the WTO in 2001. You go all the way back to 2001, China is never at the top of the major steel exporter to the United States list. It's always Canada, Mexico, Brazil.
They've been transshipping their steel. Once we cut it up, made it harder to import.
Oh my
They
God.
transshipped, including now on a large scale, to Mexico.
You
That's why they're
literally, by the way, just said like, if you go all the way back like decades, like they're still not in the top 10 or whatever. Like I kind of doubt they were trans-shipping steel back then, but okay.
agreement, even after the new treaty was negotiated, that set quotas for the steel coming in from China through Mexico. Mexico has completely disregarded that agreement and is putting steel mill factories, for example, steel pipe factories, out of business. You just can't assume. You seem to be assuming that we're functioning almost
I'm
as.
looking at the data here, and last year the United States sent more steel to Mexico than Mexico sent to the United States. They actually had a steel deficit versus where we were.
So Ian, I want to get you in here, and we're talking about steel. Trump just imposed a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports into the United States with no exceptions. That's my understanding. Number one, do you support that? Do you think and then can you add a little color commentary on your thesis on this? Because yeah, I'm hearing both sides, and I understand that it sounds like it's going to make things more expensive by 25% of anything that uses steel and aluminum, and it sounds like that potentially could pass on to the consumer. So I want to understand.
I'm very curious what they keep saying. Oh, the exporter eats some of the cost. I'm very curious what they think the pass-through rate is, because the pass-through rate tends to be pretty high. The exporters seem to only be willing to, eat up 10% of the cost, maybe 20% of the cost sometimes, but
process around your thoughts on that, and then how this is a good thing, if you do agree with Trump's tariff, on how this would be a good thing for the United States.
Before I do that, I just want to address something that Phil said. Phil said a few minutes ago that when a tariff is mooted for an industry, that industry immediately starts showering politicians with contributions and so on and so forth. I'm afraid that's an illustration of how the free trade side just doesn't have a very good set of facts, because I just read in the newspaper yesterday that the president of Ford Motors don't want a tariff on cars. So I'm afraid the basic logic of what observers...
They don't... I don't know for sure. I'm fairly certain what they were complaining about is tariffs on auto parts from Mexico and Canada, because cars cross the border 7 times between Mexico and Canada, and there's a ton of parts for cars that come over from Mexico and Canada, so it makes perfect sense why they wouldn't want materials, even if the final assembly is done here, they wouldn't want all the materials for cars to be tariffed. That makes perfect sense. What a unbelievably stupid. There's no shot. If I look up, Ford doesn't want auto tariffs. Ford will survive tariffs uncertainty. This is just him saying he thinks Ford will survive the tariff. That's not, doesn't really mean. Clearly, he thinks they're not good for him. I don't know. I could probably. Urges Trump to not cherry pick tariffs as auto industry faces multi-billion-dollar threat. But it makes perfect sense why they wouldn't want their intermediate goods to be tariffed.
Probably happens just isn't what your theory predicts. Now, moving on to the steel tariffs, the United States has to face the fact that steel is in a glut globally, both because of the mercantilism and industrial policies of foreign countries like China. They overproduced. We cut them off our market. They dumped into other countries' markets. They then start dumping into our market. And the guiding principle for both steel and aluminum was it's estimated that for this very capital-intensive industry, you need to be running the plants at 80% of output or above for their long-term viability, because you have to make enough money to be able to afford to maintain things, to be able to afford to keep up the skills of your workforce, to be able to afford to move forward.
I don't even think this got to. Oops. Not this. Capacity. You can look at capacity utilization after the tariffs. I mean, it increased for a little while, and then it seems like it kind of leveled off. And also, it's just going back to what it was in 2014.
With incremental innovations in the technology and so forth. So that's what Trump did in his first term. And the steel and aluminum tariffs were...
As noted about, the Trump administration itself admitted the industry's capacity utilization goal remained unmet when Trump decided to extend its Section 232 tariffs to downstream derivative products, blaming its failed objective on the utterly foreseeable increase in derivative imports, which, unlike their American competition, weren't forced to consume affected steel. Secretary is informing that domestic steel producers' capacity utilization has not been stabilized for an extended period of time, or above the 80% capacity utilization level identified in this report is necessary to remove the threatened impairment of the national security. Stabilizing at that level is important to find an industry reasonable expectation of market conditions will prevail long enough to justify the investment necessary to ramp up production at a sustainable and profitable level. Which, to be fair, I think they did say that we should also tariff the derivative products and everything. But
as Mark previously said, studied in great detail, and what we got was a significant increase in investment in U.S. production and jobs in return for a very small one-time raise in the price. Now, you need to have strong domestic competition if you want to keep prices under control. I absolutely agree with you that imposing a tariff and then failing to do your antitrust work at home would be a disaster. But if you have an external tariff and fierce internal competition, that's why the U.S. didn't stagnate behind tariff walls in the 19th century. Now, returning to the steel example, since the problem was at least partially solved in Trump's first term, events and patterns have shifted, so now we're back to the same problem, and that's why Trump is talking about bringing back a steel and aluminum tariff. We have to have these industries. The national security argument alone, as far as I'm concerned, for these industries settles it.
Ian, so in summary, you're almost saying that it would be problematic to the security of the United States if we did not have steel or aluminum. If we got that, we would be at the mercy of potentially other countries that could turn it off if we went to war. So am I tracking with the logic that you're saying? Am I articulating? Okay. We need to move on. I want to give Phil the ability to respond to that, but then there's a lot of other things I want to do with the time that we have left. Phil, how would you respond to the 25%, no exception, steel tariff?
Well, I keep going back to the point. The dominant sectors of steel importation into the United States are not China. They are not hostile nations. It's Canada. And in fact, we're doing more to antagonize Canada by putting the steel tariff in place for what I would argue are basically incoherent reasons. I mean, Trump has floated everything from protectionism to a weird belief that he thinks Canada is somehow ripping us off to asserting that this is leverage to make Canada the 51st state and bring them into the fold by luring a tariff exemption over them. It just doesn't make any sense here on what he's trying to achieve with this, unless you're just saying we need steel tariffs for tariff's sake. The national security arguments that are raised here in the steel industry, this is something that steel and its iron predecessors have been invoking since 1789. They've asserted that we need protection to build us up this robust industry domestically that we can't get otherwise through trade abroad. I ask the question here, I look at something like this, is like, when is steel ever going to come into its own in the United States if it hasn't in 225, 250 years of the same policy being sought after, which again, I think also goes back to the political question here. The very term lobbyist itself, do we know where this comes from? It's 1824, when Henry Clay proposed one of the earliest American protective tariffs.
I think he actually has an article about this on for the Cato Institute, which is actually probably where I remember this from. I don't think I read the full thing, but it's called like the problem of the tariff in American history, and he mentions this like tariff was essential to like early lobbying, like.
Representatives of companies descended on the lobby of the Capitol building to hand out cash and favors, seeking a favorable rate for themselves. The 19th century experience with tariffs, whatever else.
The problem with the tariff in American economic history. Yeah, Phil W. Magnus. This is him. Oh, man. Kanye West. Damn, gay. Can't say that. Really trying to fuck. Now I know how my female employees feel when they around me. What is your opinion of Donald Trump's recent tariffs? Like, repost.
else you say about the revenue component of it, one thing it is notorious for is its close connection to and attraction toward political special interests. This is a pervasive feature of 19th century tariffs. It happens time and time again with steep political repercussions. The McKinley tariff in 1890 is seen as so much of an overreach, it causes his entire party to be thrown out of the majority in Congress in the next year. The 1909 Payne-Aldrich tariff, corruption becomes so notorious over it, the political backlash to it becomes so strong that they actually adopt the income tax as a way to wean the country off of the corrupt lobbyist-infused tariff system. The Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930 consists of lobbyists descending on Washington, D.C. to get favorable rates in this measure that's supposed to protect us from the emerging Great Depression. And essentially what it does is it becomes like a race to the bottom where you can't actually extract yourself from a very problematic piece of legislation after it's passed. And Congress recognizes this 4 or 5 years later. They start saying, well, we've really screwed up. Let's hand the tariff power over to the executive branch, precisely because they knew they couldn't get out of and get away from the political corruption that descended on Washington every single time they revised the tariff schedule. So basically what it comes down to is, when you're opening the door and offering these goods, offering these favorable tax rates to certain industries by penalizing their foreign competitors, yes, the lobbyists are going to appear in Washington, D.C., and they're going to entrench it in ways that we don't anticipate and that are also politically impossible to get out of.
Literally being an argument for broad-based tariffs because we'll have more robust trust busting has been alive during the digital era. Yep. Which also, I don't even again, a big reason why tariffs, by the way, aren't typically optimal is because free trade increases the size of the market that countries are able to export to, and that increases the number of companies that are like able to exist via, new trade theory. As the size of the market increases, the size of the number of possible firms that can exist also increases, and that results in increased competition. Assume each firm only produces only one good, and that production process for these goods are characterized by increasing returns. Consumers have a taste for variety, which, to be fair, this wouldn't necessarily apply to steel, but it does apply to, say, cars. Consumers have a taste for variety and benefit from there being more goods. And then, as the size of the market increases, the total number of firms that can exist also increases, as does consumer welfare.
Unless you're involved in a long, drawn-out battle of competing industries that are, again, seeking to obtain favors from Congress.
So you're willing to have no tariffs at all and willing to open our markets to a country like China, which will itself pick which industries they think are the most advantageous, the most high value, that they think will lead to the best long-term economic futures, economic dominance, and their military power, and let them decide which ones we will have and which they have. Because when they subsidize the ones they choose, and we don't protect ourselves, that's what's going to happen. We're going to make the stuff they don't want to make. Is that the future that you envision?
Well, you keep posing this hypothetical, but we look back to the reality. We are not importing significant amounts of steel or aluminum from China. It's coming from Canada. The policy is directed toward Canada. How is taxing steel from Canada going to position us in a better place against China? It just makes no sense.
You can list things, machine tools. We invented flat screens. They're not manufactured.
He's not going to answer the question.
And there are a whole bunch of trade tactics used by other countries to take over those industries. There are a whole list of them. And China just does it on a larger scale. You seem to be prepared to accept the consequences of that. I don't. I don't want to live in a country which
you're presenting hypothetical consequences that are not happening.
They are happening. Look
so how much steel did we import from China last year?
Of this country that's taken place over the last 30 years.
We imported less steel from China than the Netherlands. Is the Netherlands a major steel producer? No.
Has the country not deindustrialized in the last 30 years? Or
in manufacturing data, absolutely not. Yes, certain
Phil W.
industries have deindustrialized, but we actually have more manufacturing output today than we did 30 years ago.
You want to respond to that one?
Yeah.
First, I want to take on the issue.
does he not have a? I don't know. Maybe he's just being nice to let us. Maybe he knows his ally here has a better response than he does because he studied it more. But these people are PhD economists who wrote books on this, and I'm a retard online, and I know I know what Phil is going to say to that. Like, I know the exact data that Phil is citing. Do these people not know that? There's no way. They know. They have to know it, and he knows that this guy has a better response, right? Can't compete with China because China is a command economy, which will magically be more efficient than a market economy. True. To be fair, what they mean is that China will pick winners and losers like they said, and subsidize their own industries for stuff. But
issue of corruption that Phil raised earlier, which is
the fact that trade between countries. I can't fucking read. I think the fact it's trade between countries that makes it so people so obtuse. They think it's war. When it's individuals, they understand trade is mutually beneficial. Yeah, no, that's weird. It's like, so, dude, I am waiting for a Republican governor to come out and say, we need to start buying more shit that's produced in Texas. No more trade deficit with California. I'm waiting for that to happen, man. I'm waiting for Greg Abbott to say that, dude. Which state has the most conservative governor? It might be Texas, honestly. I don't know, but I'm waiting for someone to try to tariff all the blue states.
Important, because we do need to be realistic about the political aspects of anything we propose.
True.
Now, one of the reasons why Mark and I did so much research in our new book on U.S. history is we wanted to look at how did tariffs get set in the 19th century when they were one of the country's signature economic policies and very successful. And it turns out that they're set by a political process. This is not Japan in the 1960s where you had technocrats making these decisions. So it's political. And you know what? Most of the tariffs that were set were correct. Sugar was a mistake. Sugar is still a mistake. The United States, for some reason, has always had a ridiculous tariff on sugar. Look it up. We can talk about it another time. The rest of the tariffs were very, very close to what you can say with 2020 hindsight America should have done in, say, 1830 or 1870 or whatever. And there are reasons for this. The first thing is outright scum-sucking corruption ticked off too many people for special interest to get away with it on an excessive scale, because you do activate consuming interests whenever you propose a tariff. So you come in and lobby for a tariff on iron ore, the iron producers will lobby you to keep the tariff down. If you get a tariff on apples, the producers of apple pie will tell you, no, we're going to lobby that to have it down. As a result, the corruption, although it certainly did exist in America in those days, was notorious.
So, I mean, he's not wrong, but there is such a thing as rational ignorance, right? So, for example, and this is literally what happens with U.S. sugar, is that because the benefits are so concentrated in a few sugar producers, but the pain that it tariffs is felt by it's so diffused, right? Like every U.S. consumer ends up paying like a little bit more on an individual level for sugar every year. I think it's on average like they pay like $30 for sugar extra every year, and the time and effort that it would take to educate yourself on the issue and then try to change the issue when you as an individual have so little power to do it. You'd have to like organize and stuff. It's actually rational for you to be ignorant. It's called rational ignorance. It's actually rational for people to not lobby against this stuff sometimes, right? Like that's the issue with a lot of concentrated benefits and sort of diffuse detriments, right?
Seriously corrupt in a lot of domains of policy with nothing to do with trade. America's trade policy was not hopelessly bent out of shape by corruption. I've given you one reason. The other reason is that the kind of industries that America used to apply the most serious tariffs on were the rising manufacturing.
Why is no one moving in here? It's only next to the landfill and all the industrial plants.
Industries of the day. And the U.S. had a lot of those because we had the world's most advanced consumer market. We had the highest percentage middle-class population, which was pulling our economy into the advanced manufacturing industries of the day, which was exactly what we should have been doing. So will there be corruption if you allow a tariff today? Sure. But there are good reasons to believe
there are definitely other industries that use a ton of sugar. Yeah, but I mean, again, I was just citing that as an example of rational ignorance. There is rational ignorance on behalf of the consumer there. There might even be rational ignorance on behalf of other industries that use sugar. But part of the issue too is that a lot of companies don't use sugar; they use high fructose corn syrup because we also subsidize corn. So part of it is companies don't want to use sugar because they like to subsidize high fructose corn syrup. I think that's part of the issue too, or sugar. But
it will be kept in check by opposition to tariffs. And as I said before, it's not a secret which industries are important. We know that producing cars is a strategically important industry and producing T-shirts is not. Okay? This is not a very difficult decision.
Does he know what Donald Trump thinks about that?
Decision to make. The politics is difficult, complicated, and there's a million complexities in implementation. But in terms of what an advanced economy looks like, that's pretty much a matter of agreement from Tokyo to Topeka.
All right, we're gonna move on. I think we could talk about this all day long. I appreciate your both perspective here. Here's my initial thoughts, and I'm gonna ask you this Phil first, is I see Trump as kind of a mob boss from a standpoint of like he's like threatening Canada with tariffs, Mexico with tariffs. I don't think he was actually planning on. I think he used it as a negotiation tool, which seems like it would backfire majorly if it didn't work. But to date, it seems like Trump has kind of gotten his way as it relates to negotiating. So what would you tell the people that are like, hey, Trump has imposed?
I think, which to be fair, he announces 90-day pause to negotiate with other countries or whatever. But this was filmed, February 14th. So, have things changed already, man?
Tariff threats. And he seems to be getting people to close up the border, fentanyl, like all these things. What are your thoughts around that? Do you think it's a Trump? He's bluffing and it's working right now until it doesn't, or do you think it's just a bad? We're making enemies with our neighbors to the north and the south.
So Trump is definitely using it at certain times as a negotiating tool, but I don't think he's as good of a negotiator as he thinks he is. We can take the case of the first tariff,
which also, by the way, apparently people don't. I was informed that. Apparently this has happened before, so I can't use as harsh language or whatever. But Donald Trump and Peter Navarro both said VATs are trade barriers, which is not true. If they go into negotiations with the mindset that VATs are actually trade barriers, they could actually not believe that and just are using it as an excuse to tariff these countries. Then that negotiation is probably not going to go super well because a lot of these countries rightly are going to be hesitant to remove their VAT or reduce their VAT, which they rely on for revenue. And again, it's a trade neutral revenue generating mechanism, tax.
That he threatened against Canada.
Trade neutral way to raise
over fentanyl enforcement. Look at the DEA's website. How much fentanyl came into the United States from Canada in the last year? It was less than a suitcase. It's like 0.2% of all fentanyl coming into the United States across the northern border. And that's a very large border. It's actually not a crisis. Second, what did he get in return for this? He says, okay, we're going to demand enforcement from Canada. Justin Trudeau, who supposedly paid to him, read the terms of what Justin Trudeau offered in return. It's the exact same plan that Trudeau agreed to with Biden on December 17th, 2024, and posted all over the Canadian government's website. Trump declared that's a victory. I look at it and I say, this is political rhetoric. But in the meantime, what's he done? He's soured relationships between two allied nations. Weirdly, he's thrown a bone to the Trudeau government, which was teetering at the brink of collapse, and is probably going to get thrown out in the next election up there. But at the same time, Trump is just pursuing kind of like this reckless course for very little gains in return. Then he turns around a week later and says, oh, by the way, we're no longer using it as a negotiating tool. I have tariffs for a different reason, a protective reason, because we're worried about steel from China, but you Canada, you're actually our biggest steel importer into the United States. Therefore, we're going to put a tariff on steel. Canada's probably looking at this and asking the question, like, what is this guy up to? Because he's contradicting himself in his stated goals, his stated negotiating tactics, and the stated policies that he's actually carrying through on. That just brings chaos, uncertainty, and bad will and animosity between two countries that should be peaceful and have historically been trading partners on a very reliable basis.
Mark, what would be your response? And then I also want to get to your guys' thoughts around tax breaks and all.
You say that this is an area of agreement with Phil.
Hey.
That and the corruption of the sugar industry. I agree completely on that as well.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, that's amazing.
Nothing like that in our book. We're not talking about those uses of just using them as weapons. No, in politics, nothing's off the table. Okay, but that's not our focus. We're trying to, do what's good for the U.S. economy long term.
Yep.
Not broadly based prosperity and a great future 10 years from now, not ending up as a colony.
Okay, so let me ask this next question. So I think of the tax code as a complex, super complex, but the idea is incentivize what you want. So like the example of having kids, we want to have more kids, we're going to incentivize that. The government doesn't want to build real estate, we're going to create incentives for people in the free market to build real estate. If you look at the tax code, a lot of people say it's loopholes, but at the end of the day, they're incentives, and the hope would be that the government is getting a better end of the deal to have someone else take that on. Phil, do you like or endorse these incentives as relates to tax breaks, credits? What is your thoughts on that? And then I'm going to hand that over to Ian and hear his perspective. And then Mark, I'm going to mute you while you're not talking, so we're getting a little bit of feedback.
Yeah. So my general philosophy of taxes is that the tax system itself should be low, not economically burdensome and onerous, transparent, easy to identify, easy to enforce, and generally operate in such a way that is not extractive of a toll on the economy. And yet also provide enough revenue to fulfill the basic functions of the government. I think we're all in agreement on that. This, I think, raises the question of why we switched from the tariff to the income tax system. Well, it turns out tariffs are historically popular, not just because of all of the reasons that we've been discussing here. Tariffs were historically a favored tool of taxation because they're easy to enforce at the border at a time in economic development when you don't have the means to actually collect something like an income tax. And we see this in the world today. What countries draw the majority of their revenue or a sizable part of their revenue still from tariffs? It's mostly
developing
extremely
real estate
underdeveloped
capacity.
economies, a lot of them in Africa, or it's places like Venezuela that are basically economic basket cases, still use tariffs as a major source of tax revenue because it's the one point that they can actually successfully enforce. Now, you move into an advanced economy, something like the income tax becomes a much more practical tool to actually implement because you have means to enforce it by deducting straight out of the payroll, by having employers participate as part of that deduction process, by having a uniform system that everyone knows April 15th they file their tax returns. So it's not only just a question of what the level should be, it's about the complexity, it's about the transparency of the system. And I think one of the things, even though I'm in favor of income tax cuts, I'm generally skeptical of the income tax as a huge redistributive system. One thing
the other guy did the sorry. And the other guy did the above the Frey Act.
that it actually does seem to function well at doing is raising revenue at a pretty robust level in a way that everyone understands exactly what they're paying, when, and where.
Yeah. So you would not be in favor of taking out the 16th Amendment and if not having income tax. You're
So-
in favor
He
of having some
probably
income
would.
tax.
My caveat
that.
there is I would not be in favor of adding other taxes on top of the existing income tax system unless at the constitutional level we were going to completely alter and reform the 16th Amendment.
But you would be in
Because-
favor of that.
So if we could abolish the 16th Amendment, yes, then let's talk about other types of taxation. If we
would
have
you
the
be
16th Amendment,
pro-tariff
which
if there was no income tax?
potentially I consider it.
All right, Ian. I want to hear your thoughts around tax incentives. Do you endorse that? And then I would also like to hear your quick take on: would you want to abolish the income tax, and could tariffs? Because that's what Trump has been throwing out there. It's like external revenue service, and everyone loves when other people pay their stuff. You know, if these big corporations can pay my taxes, I'm all for that.
They're going to say tariffs are free because, again, exporters eat it and exchange rate appreciation. Let's see
be
it.
your take on those two things? And know that we have about 5 minutes, and then we got to wrap this up.
Okay. I want to begin by agreeing with Phil that tariffs in the U.S. today wouldn't throw off enough revenue to fund the entire government or even to abolish income tax. You could certainly fund a tax cut of whatever percentage. The other thing I would say is that the issue you've raised now is actually discontinuous with our earlier discussion, because you're talking about the generic concept of U.S. tax policy. Now, the first thing I will say is a lot of that simply turns on what spending profile and level you favor for the U.S. government, because if you believe there should be a lot of spending, there's necessarily going to be a lot of taxes. If you believe there should not be a lot of spending, you can get the opposite result. The problem with that eternally is that the government's major spending items are war, pensions, medicine, and debt. And all four of those, there are very serious reasons why it's very hard to cut our defense budget in the face of a building second Cold War. Cut the medical budget. Okay, well, good luck unscrambling the U.S. medical system.
True. I know. This is. I need to find. I'll make a Notion page about like the revenue estimates of tariffs versus VATs, because I think unironically, considering the reduction in output that you're going to get with tariffs, with Trump's tariffs and everything, I think unironically, like a 10% VAT would probably raise more money than these tariffs. So, in what world is a 10% tariff better than a 10% VAT? And if these fucking retards think that a VAT is a trade barrier, like this is the truly reciprocal thing, right? Like we're being more reciprocal by doing a VAT than like these other fucking bullshit things. I guess if you think Donald Trump's numbers are real, then you might not think it's actually actually whatever. But why can't I swear I was able to use. Do I need to use like the bigger power lines? How do I build this shit in water?
Has defeated the efforts of some of the smartest people in the country. Pension, Social Security. You're going to cut Social Security. Really? I dare you. And then debt. So the U.S. has already incurred this debt, and you have to pay the interest rate you agreed to. Otherwise, you collapse your financial markets. So this idea that you could cut spending to the point where you could just finance it like it's 1832 and you do everything with tariffs, no, that's just not...
Which, yeah, by the way, when tariffs were a major revenue generator in the U.S., government spending was like 3% of GDP. Government spending is like 26% of GDP today on the federal level, so...
Mathematically there.
Yep.
In terms of the issue of... Did you want to say something,
You're
Mark?
talking about using tax breaks.
Yeah. I would love to hear, Mark, your thoughts on using tax breaks.
Well, you know, there are some differences between direct government spending, say for research or pilot projects, or paying for the manufacturing extension program for small businesses, and using tax breaks. In some cases, you can do one or the other. They both work. There are cases where tax breaks don't work because there's no revenue to take it against, for example. And there are cases where you need to be more specific in terms of what you want, in terms of portfolio investments, still not picking a company. So, but basically they have similar,
my buddy
not
Randy's
exact, similar effects. If you're willing to acknowledge there's a role for one, there's also a role for the other.
Yeah, and you're not in favor of abolishing income tax. You don't think that'd be a great idea, Mark?
Well, I'm not a tax guy, but I think that's a pipe dream. I think
Yeah,
that's really.
yeah, and I tend to agree with that. I don't necessarily. I'm not banking on this happening. I can dream about it. Last question for you all is predictions. We're just getting started with Trump's second term. What is your prediction? Phil, we'll go with you first. What is your prediction of what we will see over these next 4 years with the economy, with taxes in general, tariffs? What's your prediction?
Yeah. So start with the good, and I'll say something in favor of Trump. He does seem to be taking.
Wait, who is Rand? Is Randy a streamer or anything? Or is Randy just a random guy?
A more conscientious approach in this term than he did in his last on reining in government waste. So the other side of the revenue equation, and this is thing like the Doge. Now we can debate the tactics that they're using, but at least there's some attention to this problem that's being paid. On the other hand, he seems to be entering the term using tariffs much more aggressively and right out the gate. This is something that in his previous term, they actually had a more prolonged debate. It wasn't until 2018 that we got our first really aggressive major tariff policy under Trump. And that worries me because I think he's already caused...
this guy? I don't want to debate this guy in tariffs. Isn't this guy... I'm pretty sure this guy rated me once. Isn't this guy literally a fucking groiper? Dude, this guy's going to be pro-tariffs because he thinks it's bad to buy shit from Jews. I don't... There's not going to be any interesting economic discussion with this guy, I don't think. I'm fairly certain this dude is a fucking groiper. I don't know. Zoomer and name opinion discarded. I mean, if he has like an actual position on tariffs beyond don't buy from Jewish people, then maybe. But I'm
plenty of concern and turmoil on Wall Street with his contradictory messaging here. And again, I guess to kind of bring it back to the point that I made to start us off then, Trump needs to really hone down on his message around the tariff and figure out which of these three competing and often intention goals he's actually using them for, because
it's not going to be an interesting debate. It's not going to be an interesting debate, dude.
He continues vacillating between the three, the more uncertainty there is, the more turmoil there is, the longer it will take for the rest of the world to figure out what he's doing and actually respond to it. Even if we disagree with what he does, it would be better to have certainty with what he plans to do rather than this chaos of flipping between negotiating tactics, revenue and external revenue service, protection, and then back to negotiating tactics all in the course of a single week.
Yep. Thank you, Phil. Ian, we'll go over to you. What's your prediction on what to expect?
When I wrote my first book, one of the things I learned is that you can make generalizations about broad patterns that are going to happen in the future, but specific events are too dependent on other contingent human decisions, so it's just a waste of time. It's a party trick. What I will say is that the days of trying to understand the Trump administration by taking as your base premise that the guy's a blithering idiot are over. The guy pulled off the greatest political comeback in the...
If he wants to, tell him to... Is he here even? If you tell him to join a Discord if he really wants to fucking talk about tariffs, but I'm not going to, like... If his point is just, like, fucking Jewish people, then I'm not going to care, but...
History of the United States. I'm not a Trump supporter, but the man is not an idiot. I have to assume, therefore, that when he does crazy...
I don't know. Seems like he's pretty dumb. Seems like he's done pretty dumb things here specifically, too. I don't know, guys.
There's method to the madness. So I have...
I just told you. Tell him to... If he wants to... Tell him to DM me and join the Discord server. Tell him to... DM me sometime or something. Like, if he wants to set
explanations
up,
as to why he did the Canada-Mexico thing. There's not time for them now. But I would above all emphasize, figure out what the guy thinks he's doing, why he thinks it will work, who told him to do it, what he thinks the objectives are, what he thinks the posturing is, what the feint is, what the sequence...
Randy? I don't have Randy's... if you send me Randy's Discord server, he's more clout than you? I don't... he could.
Of anticipated back and forth is... That's the way I would go about figuring out what's going on the next 4 years.
And thank you, Ian. Mark, we left the best for last, man. You land the plane here. Do you believe that inflation is going to be a thing? And I want to hear your thoughts on Trump, but do you believe inflation is going to be increased in the next 4 years due to his decision?
I can't really speak to that. There's so many factors that go into whether we're going to have inflation or not, and I have no expertise on that.
I feel like the economic discussion off the case was really going on anyways. I'm against the executive branch unilaterally levying taxes and putting it in his bucket. Yeah, that is... I'm hopeful. I'm pretty hopeful that the Supreme Court will actually stop the tariffs from happening. I think Legal Eagle made a video about it, so maybe we should watch that at some point too. But like, it's the way Trump is imposing these tariffs, even if it is constitutional, is bad. It is bad. There's no reason the president should have this. Oh, what's up, Randy? Tariffs are good though. Why? And don't mention Jews.
But I will sort of pick up the baton here on what I think lies ahead in terms of the areas we're talking about. I think tariffs are here to stay.
Anyway, we still have a 10% tariff on everything other than the USMCA compliant goods.
And I know a lot about the people who are working on that in this administration. They're
I think
I think they're quite
literally
intelligent. I think they will be elaborated, refined, but they will find them in many different places where they're needed and where they haven't been for a very long time. Secondly, and very importantly, it looks like there's a strong kernel of interest in bringing down the dollar to a level, to the correct level. What's the correct level? It's the level of balances trade, because that's the way those exchange rate markets are supposed to work. That's new, and I think that will become, it'll get into the Overton window, and we'll start working on it. What I'm most afraid of is, I think what maybe Phil likes, is that we'll take a meat axe to government spending programs, like, for example, NIH. That's a crown jewel of America.
I think it's kind of. I think Trump accidentally stumbled into getting the dollar to be weaker. I kind of doubt he's even. I doubt Trump personally is even committed to the idea of dollar being weaker, because I don't think he understands what that even means. But because people are freaking the fuck out and dumping their U.S. dollars, I think he's kind of stumbled into that. But
American industrial policy produces the most productive new drug industry in the world. It's very profitable, hires people at very high salaries, and not that it couldn't use improvement. All these bureaucracies can use improvement, but slashing away is not the way to do it. And I hope that it doesn't go that way.
Well, maybe we'll have you guys back on and talk about why the U.S. dollar should be less valuable, because I'm ignorant on that. That doesn't sound like something I like, but I want to be open-minded to that. And then I for sure think we can all agree that we should cut unnecessary spending. And then, but obviously there's things that are necessary. I think that's where the debate lies, is what is necessary. And there's a lot that could be unpacked. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for being on. This was, I feel very grateful to learn from you all, and from the just bottom of my heart and our whole community. Thank you. And we look forward to seeing where you guys go in the future. We'll have any links. And
even like the weaker dollar in his first term, this isn't a new idea for him. But wanting the U.S. dollar to be strong isn't a new idea for him early either. I think he said contradictory things on the dollar.
Anything that you want us to promote down below, and so including your contact info if you want that. If you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this, you can check out the description below to get more information on all of our guests. Guys, thank you.
Very well.
Thank you very much.
Wow. Disclaimer. I want to see the legal thing. I sent the Discord link. If this guy really wants to join a Discord, he can. But I'm just warning you. If he's not interested in economics, if he's just going to tell me that we should make everything ourselves because American culture is so great or something.
President Trump has done.
It's just not going to be an interesting conversation. I don't really care to talk about that. Okay, I'm curious the legal thing. I think Cato has a thing too. The Cato presidential tariff path and the need for reform. Would you debate me on microeconomics? What about it? Economies of scale? What about it? The Cato Institute, it's over? RIP fly high. Okay. I guess it's over for me. I don't know what I did. I cited Cato one time. This guy's just like PPG. What's up, Gilberts, and welcome back. Economies of scale are fake localism only. This is true, Cat Tricks. This is true. This is true. I think one of the things Trump cited for his tariffs, the law doesn't even mention tariffs by name, or doesn't even. I shouldn't even grant it. Like, doesn't even technically mention tariffs by name or whatever. It just doesn't mention tariffs. It's just like, it's probably not the whatever emergency economic power thing that he invoked probably does not even grant the tariffs that he used. But legally, will know. Where do you stand though? Ideologically, I'm a liberal.
On the impossible, he has united the country in condemning tariffs, especially the broad mercantilist tariffs that he implemented on April 2nd. Wall Street is reeling, stocks are in free fall. The S&P 500 had its worst day in 5 years and continues to tumble. Between filming this and when
I'm a neoliberal. I'm a neoliberal. I don't know what to tell you. Liberal, generally free market oriented, so like still capitalist, free market guy. But I you know, I'm generally going to support some type of economic interventions or whatever. What else? I don't know. Like, I don't.
We upload. There's no possible way to predict how much worse this is going to get, so I'm just going to point here, and editors just let people know how bad things are. But there might be a silver lining. The authority that President Trump used to implement these tariffs is extremely dubious, and it's possible that courts might step in and overrule them. Now, if I was a betting man, I'm not sure I would bet against the tariffs, especially with this particular Supreme Court. But by the same token, there is a decent chance that these tariffs get overruled. So let's talk about what happened and what's going to happen. On April 2nd, from the serene backdrop of the White House Rose Garden, Trump dropped an economic bomb with reverberations felt around the world. During an announcement he dubbed Liberation Day, for reasons, Trump declared the imposition of sweeping tariffs against our country's trade partners, which unleashed global panic and confusion over how these tariffs were calculated and the immediate international threats of retaliatory measures. In fact, the very next day, Chinese lawmakers forewent celebrating a national holiday to hit back, imposing a brutal 34% tariff on all American imports that mirrors the tariffs that President Trump ostensibly put on Chinese imports. And so the U.S. stock market crashed even further. Apple, for example, lost $311 billion in market value. Tesla lost $143 billion in market value, and the bloodbath continues. But Trump and his administration are telling Americans to just take a big picture view because we're definitely headed for a glorious stock market boom any day now. Just trust me, bro. Yes, that's right. Trump wants us to believe that an economic death spasm rivaling the COVID pandemic will somehow inure to our economic benefit. Trump himself has likened the wounded economy to a patient recovering from a traumatic operation. He took to Truth Social to proclaim, quote, "The operation is over, the patient lived and is healing." But in a televised speech, President Trump announced the imposition of a 10% baseline tariff on all foreign imports to the United States. Trump also proclaimed additional punitive customized tariffs on roughly 60 of the world's, quote, worst offenders, or countries that Trump seems to think charge higher tariffs on U.S. goods out of malice, impose non-tariff barriers to U.S. trade, or have otherwise behaved in ways the administration feels undermines U.S. economic goals. But spoiler alert, for the most part, that's complete nonsense. But these custom-made tariffs include a 20% tariff on EU goods, a 46%
Okay, yes, I know tariffs are bad. What's the actual?
made up.
Get the legal.
Deputy Minister of Finance pointed out that Trump's 46% tariff on Vietnamese goods bore little resemblance to Vietnam's 9.4% combined rate of all their tariffs to figure out the Trump. And as Ian Dunn summarized, quote, Trump's team appears to have taken the U.S.
Are you only focused on economics to do other topics? I mean, right now, mainly focused on economic. Yes, I know the equation. Yes, I know he lied. Right now, I guess, I don't know. I'm probably mainly talking about this stuff, but like, I guess I do other topics too, I guess.
Exports. The U.S.
I don't know. I talk about politics generally sometimes whenever there's crazy shit, like when it, like, I don't know, if the like Signal Gate shit happens, I'll talk about that. When Trump is, when we talked about for a little bit today, like the Supreme Court new order saying that this shit's on fire. Trump has to facilitate the return of the Maryland father that was deported to El Salvador.
Has a 17.9 billion trade deficit with Indonesia, and Indonesian exports to the U.S. are 28 billion. They divided 17.9 by 28, got 0.64, and presented it as a 64% tariff. It's hard to state just how nonsensical that actually is. You might as well divide the numbers of apples in your kitchen by the number of bagels and use it to calculate your mortgage rate. To criticize it on political or economic grounds is too generous. It operates below the level of rational thought. James Harwicki also explained, quote, "It's also important to understand that the tariff rates that foreign countries are supposedly charging us."
Okay, yes, I understand. I know he lied. Yes,
which critics
I know.
Many have pointed out, two of the elements cancel each other out, making it nothing.
Yes, I know.
Together
Yes, very dumb. Very dumb. Very dumb. Very dumb. He doesn't understand economics.
So on the left-hand side of the column, they purport to say what is the staggering, mind-boggling, jaw-cracking, gum.
Yep, true.
It will help find you the right attorney. You know, national emergency with respect to foreign, quote, trade practices that contribute to large and persistent annual United States goods trade deficits under the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This act gives the president powers to regulate various financial transactions where there is, quote, any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or in substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat. Now, to take a step back for a moment, the U.S. president has no innate powers to set tariffs or regulate commerce. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution expressly gives the authority to set tariffs and to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations solely to Congress. The president's purported power to impose tariffs must therefore arise from authority expressly delegated to them by Congress. Now, specifically, IEPA states, quote, any authority granted to the president by Section 1702 of this title may be exercised to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or in substantial part outside the United States to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat. And now you might wonder what authority is granted under Section 1702. Well, that section states the president may investigate, block during the pendency of an investigation, regulate, direct and compel, nullify, void, prevent or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, withdrawal, transportation, importation, or exportation of, or dealing in or exercising any right, power, or privilege with respect to or transactions involving any property in which any foreign country or national thereof has any interest by any person or with respect to any property subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. And while IEPA accords a number of powers to the president, such as allowing the president to investigate, block, or regulate, quote, any transactions with foreign exchange with respect to any property subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, it does not explicitly authorize tariffs, which is a significant omission according to legal scholars. In fact, the words tariff, tax, and duty appear nowhere in the statute. So one argument here is that IEPA is simply doesn't authorize the president to exercise tariff powers. The argument goes that if Congress had intended to delegate its tariff power under IEEPA, it could have used tariff terms or set forth a tariff-related process to establish the factual predicate for and appropriate levels of such tariffs, as it's done with other trade statutes, but it didn't do so here. And in apparent recognition of this omission, no U.S. president until now has used IEEPA to impose tariffs. Presidents have instead used IEEPA to freeze the assets of foreign governments and nationals, to limit the export of technologies and ban imports from adversaries, and most recently to ban imports of Russian energy, seafood, and alcoholic beverages, but never to impose tariffs. But that's not to say that presidents in the past have not imposed tariffs in an emergency situation. Presidents have traditionally imposed tariffs in response to national security threats using Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. And Trump himself used Section 232 to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum during his first term in office. Trump also used Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose tariffs against China for unfair trading practices. So why did Trump now change course and choose IEEPA as authority for the tariffs based on this national emergency? Well, possibly because the Trade Expansion Act requires an investigation into the effect of specific imports on U.S. national security and a related report to be issued within 270 days. IEEPA contains no such check on immediate presidential action, possibly because it doesn't even authorize tariffs. But even if IEEPA did explicitly authorize the imposition of tariffs, Trump's use of the statute could be problematic because it relies on the presumption that trade deficits constitute national emergencies or unusual threats. By its own terms, IEEPA only applies where 1, the president legally declares a national emergency, and 2, the emergency at issue poses a, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. One legal scholar has pointed out
Our trade deficit with Cambodia definitely falls into an unusual and extraordinary threat to national security.
the emergency at issue
Our
poses
sorry, not our trade deficit. Our trade deficit in goods. Only our trade deficit in goods, which is even more insane.
quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. One legal scholar has pointed out that far from being an emergency, a bilateral trade deficit is nothing new, has existed for decades, and are actually not a problem at all. Or as reporter Mike Masnick put it, quote, the only emergency here is that nobody in the administration understands what trade deficits are. Now, allowing Trump to invoke a statute that does not expressly grant tariff authority and applies only during national emergencies to levy tariffs at his whim will give him and any future presidents carte blanche to invoke any inconvenience as an emergency triggering unchecked imposition of IEEPA sanctions. But that being said, this Supreme Court has been particularly loath to remove any kind of presidential power or put in place any kind of check on presidential power. So the implications here are simply tariff. Now, in addition to the potential inapplicability of IEEPA to justify Trump's most recent imposition of tariffs, other legal doctrines might support the argument that Trump's actions are ultra vires, which is a fancy term for saying that they are unauthorized and therefore invalid. In particular, the non-delegation doctrine might be used to invalidate Trump's IEEPA-based tariffs proclamation. This is a doctrine that's based on the Constitution's Article 1 separation of powers principles. The doctrine purports to limit Congress's ability to delegate away its legislative powers to other agencies and seeks to ensure that legislative decisions are instead made through a bicameral process by elected members of Congress or government officials subject to constitutional accountability. As explained by Justice Alito, quote, the principle that Congress cannot delegate away its vested powers exists to protect liberty. Our Constitution, by careful design, prescribes a process for making law, and within that process there are many accountability checkpoints. It would dash the whole scheme if Congress could give away its power to an entity that is not constrained by those checkpoints. The Constitution's deliberative process was viewed by the framers as a valuable feature, not something to be lamented and evaded. Now, the Supreme Court clarified the non-delegation doctrine in J.W. Hampton versus United States, which held that when Congress does delegate its authority to another branch of government, such as the executive branch, it must articulate a, quote, intelligible principle to which the executive branch must conform to avoid, quote, forbidden delegation of legislative power. A congressional delegation of legislative power to the president would be permissible where, quote, what the president is required to do is merely an execution of the act of Congress and is the mere agent of the lawmaking department. But courts have traditionally interpreted the intelligible principle standard leniently, upholding delegations of authority if Congress applies any intelligible principle whatsoever to constrain the delegation's use. And in addition, the doctrine was never particularly consistently used, and the Supreme Court hasn't invalidated federal statute on non-delegation grounds since 1935. And historically, there's been a lot of worry that the Supreme Court would use a non-delegation doctrine to strike down the use of presidential power when one party had the presidency and not another party, which found support in relatively recent Supreme Court signaling to revive the non-delegation doctrine and impose a stricter intelligible principle standard. For example, in 2019, Justices Gorsuch, Thomas, Alito, and Roberts expressed a renewed interest to strengthen the non-delegation doctrine in Gundy versus United States. And while that decision ultimately upheld the delegation of power to the Attorney General under the Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act, Justice Gorsuch, joined by Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Thomas dissenting, found that the delegation of authority to the Attorney General did violate the non-delegation doctrine. And just last month, the Supreme Court heard arguments on the contours of the doctrine in FCC versus Consumer Research. But to bring it back to tariffs, as one commentator put it, Trump's claims to virtually limitless tariff authority under the IEEPA undermine virtually any constitutional constraints on delegation. If the courts are going to impose any limits on executive delegation at all, they have to draw the line here. But again, I would never bet money on this court curtailing the president's power or authority. But another potential avenue that is similar to the non-delegation doctrine is the major questions doctrine. It's a canon of statutory interpretation pursuant to which courts presume that Congress does not delegate issues of major political or economic significance to executive agencies. Theoretically, courts apply the doctrine in service of the constitutional rule that Congress may not divest itself of its legislative power by transferring that power to an executive agency. So the major question doctrine requires Congress to, quote, speak clearly when authorizing the executive branch to make decisions of vast economic and political significance. If there is no such clarity, courts may reject the executive assertion of power. The doctrine therefore prohibits the executive branch from simply relying on ambiguous, open-ended statutes as the basis for sweeping policy changes. Though this doctrine too has been widely criticized for striking down one side's policy preferences and not the others. For example, in 2022 in West Virginia versus EPA, the Supreme Court cited the major questions doctrine to strike down a Biden administration effort to interpret provisions of the 1970 Clean Air Act to allow the EPA to regulate greenhouse emissions. In doing so, the court stated that, quote, in certain extraordinary cases, both separation of powers principles and a practical understanding of legislative intent make us reluctant to read into ambiguous statutory text the delegation claim to be lurking there. The agency instead must point to clear congressional authorization for the power it claims. The Supreme Court also used the major questions doctrine, which Justice Gorsuch has praised as, quote, a vital check on expansive and aggressive assertions of executive authority to block Biden's use of emergency power for his COVID vaccine mandate, evictions moratorium, and student loan forgiveness. The major questions doctrine has received a lot of criticism in the past, and as law professor Steve Vladeck describes, in his great newsletter One First, quote, one of the most common criticisms of the major question doctrine has been its subjectivity. Whether a specific program involves a matter of, quote, vast economic or political significance will often be in the eye of the beholder. And even when it's clear that it is, the threshold the doctrine requires for statutory clarity is at best a matter of debate. That said, if the broad but open-ended delegation of power in the HEROES Act, that's the Student Loan Forgiveness, was insufficient, it sure seems like IEPA isn't any clearer, and it also seems like President Trump's tariffs ought to meet any judge's test for a matter of vast economic or political significance. One need look no further than the stock markets for proof of that. Thus, if judges and justices are going to be consistent about the major questions doctrine, there seems to be plenty of support for the conclusion that IEPA is insufficiently clear to support Trump's tariffs. But one might ask, what could possibly be more of a major question?
I think there's, by the way, already been, he might mention these even. I know there's already like a lawsuit in like a circuit court in Florida about this, but I believe there's other lawsuits as well. I believe multiple people have already sued Trump for the tariffs. So.
Sweeping use of IEPA to start the biggest trade war in a century. The argument would be that applying the major questions doctrine to IEPA shows that Congress did not clearly authorize the president to impose broad-based tariffs. So the argument would be that not only did Congress not clearly enumerate tariffs as a possible sanction under the act, but the act also is silent with respect to a mandate in how to exercise any such power. And in the absence of any such congressional clarity on the question of vast economic significance, a court might reject Trump's exercise of power. As Georgetown law professor Jennifer Hillman put it, quote, courts should find that allowing Trump to wave his magic Sharpie to sign an IEPA executive order imposing tariffs would upset the balance Congress has long sought to strike when it delegates its tariff authority to the president. To permit IEPA, a statute that does not mention tariffs and is designed to deal with unusual and extraordinary threats to America's national security, to be used to impose tariffs at whatever level the president decides in order to create leverage to address any national emergency is to suggest that there are virtually no limits on the president's power to impose tariffs. This can subvert the rule of law, undermine the Constitution and its separation of powers, risk exacerbating tensions with our trading partners, and invite destructive retaliation. Now, so far we've only talked about potential judicial solutions to this whole fiasco, but there is a potential legislative solution as well. Congress could arguably claw back its authority that it supposedly delegated to the president under IEPA. But this would be an uphill battle in light of a 1983 Supreme Court ruling that put a chokehold on congressional powers to curb authority delegated to the president. Now, prior to 1983, Congress often used legislative vetoes to retain oversight over the executive branch's actions, allowing one or both houses of Congress to overturn actions taken by the executive branch based on delegation of powers from the legislature to the executive. But in INS versus Trotta in 1983, the Supreme Court struck down a one-house legislative veto as unconstitutional, effectively clawing back the congressional power to override executive actions delegated to the executive branch by Congress, because the unilateral vetoes violated the principles of bicameralism, requiring passage by both houses of Congress, and presentment requiring the president's signature. So long story short, as a result of that case, the invalidation of an executive exercise of delegated authority generally requires a two-thirds majority vote in both houses of Congress because they have to be able to override a presidential veto. And here, while there is some indication that some Republican lawmakers might cross party lines, including Rand Paul's recent criticisms of the new tariffs as unconstitutional.
They did do for Canada. But only for Canada, and that's only in the Senate, right? I think it still has to go to the House, and who knows? Debate Randy on tariffs tomorrow. Well, okay, if Randy tells me the issue is, I don't want to. I don't want to have some dumb discussion about like culture and about Jewish people and about the bullshit shit that growing peers are going to bring up. If Randy gives me a clear position on tariffs that's actually about economics, then we can set it up.
There is little reason to believe that a measure clawing back presidential power conferred by IEPA would reach the two-thirds vote required in both houses to pass. So it may, in fact, be the case that those wishing to challenge Trump's exercise of tariff power would have better chances in a courtroom. And
based on what? Based on, just give me a...
events that will surprise no one at this point, a storm of lawsuits immediately followed Trump's Liberation Day tariff bomb. The day after, on April 3rd, Emily Lay Paper, Doing Business is Simplified, filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida, based on Trump's prior imposition of tariffs on all
Discord
imports.
link in chat. Didn't I? Exclamation point Discord in chat. Like, you can DM me. So.
In conjunction with the New Civil Liberties Alliance, a libertarian nonprofit, the lawsuit challenges Trump's unlawful use of emergency powers to impose tariffs on the grounds that, among other things, IEPA does not authorize the imposition of tariffs, and two, Trump's attempted imposition of tariffs under IEPA violates the non-delegation doctrine. But it's particularly interesting to look at the media's response to all this as global markets have roiled. With 364 news platforms covering the tariffs, about 35% were left-leaning, 40% were on the center, and 25% came from the...
Exactly, like that's what I'm...
Right. And when you examine the headlines, you start to see some very different frames emerge that shape how readers interpret and understand the events that are unfolding. On the right, the most common theme is to describe the ongoing event as a panic, which places emphasis on how investors are reacting and possibly irrationally. This is in contrast to the left, where the word meltdown is more commonly used, suggesting a catastrophic disaster. And then from the center, we see a greater emphasis on potential future consequences like economic nuclear winter or the U.S. Federal Reserve cutting interest rates. And the headlines that you read first have immense power to shape how you understand the news, and that's why I like to get the news from as many angles as I can, which I do with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way to read the news. And right now, they're offering Legal Eaglets 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. You can scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get a discount for a limited time. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the...
Okay, don't care. I think it's the end. Yep. I feel like the tariff shit is probably the place where the Supreme Court is most likely to save us. Probably. Who knows? Okay, well, I'm going to go edit the shit that I got from yesterday and today. And then tomorrow we'll read, or I guess maybe Randy will do something with. We'll see. Yeah. Let's see. Do you think anyone except Tom Fuller is streaming on YouTube? Redirect, add, search. Okay, Sarah's streaming. Okay, you guys gonna go to Sarah? Oh no, you can go to Pisco actually. I'm sending it to Pisco. Oh, wait, is he even live yet? Wait, I don't think it's. Hold on, I don't want to rate him if he's literally not live. He's starting soon. Never mind. Hold on, he's starting soon though. I can wait. I think we're gonna eventually we'll read fuck, I don't know if we'll read the whole thing. I probably want to read Pop Internationalism, but I don't even know. I don't even know if some of this shit is worth it, man. I don't know. Oh fuck. How do I pull this out? Fuck. No. Why is this? No. My library. There we go. I don't even know if some of this shit is worth it, man. Pop International is good for seeing how long we've been dealing with this nonsense. I know. It's funny to see that, like, dude, we need a fucking reprint of it. Because I had it downloaded. I've had it downloaded for a while, and I've skimmed through parts of it. But it's funny to see, like, how like the same exact quotes are still entirely relevant today. Jesus. Oh yeah, we should watch these at some point. This is from the Behind the Curve guy. Oh, this is him hating on Biden.
Latest projection, which
I skimmed through this.
incorporates their estimates of what these industrial policies are going to do, but that's only the plus side of growth in manufacturing. They also incorporate many other industries where there are declines, and they conclude the share of manufacturing is going to continue to fall for the next decade in the US. So the bottom line is we do have a revitalization in certain states. 4 of them happen to be key swing states as we look into this election, but they happen to be the Sun Belt swing states. The Rust Belt is not going to see much from these industrial policies in the way of job creation. But altogether, we have to start thinking about other policies, or to start emphasizing other policies, both for left behind people and left behind places.
So thanks, Robert. Danny, may I ask your view about industrial policy here in the US, what the Biden administration got right and what...
Biden.
Yeah, it's going to be boring because
we need to stop pretending the Rust Belt is real.
Really agree on this, and I agree with everything that he said. I am a supporter of these industrial policies. I think it wasn't that industrial policy ever went away in the United States. U.S. There's a historical continuity in the U.S. In terms of the conduct of industrial policy. Well, when we think of industrial policies, often though it was early on, it was in agriculture, for example, with the land grant colleges in the 1960s and so forth. But essentially, extension services and the provision of various incentives to promote productive upgrading. Of course, then during the whole of after the Second World War, it was through the defense spending, procurement, DARPA, and so forth. And these efforts have often been behind many of the important innovations in the U.S. economy. And so what is different now, I think, under Biden is that these industrial policy has become respectable again, and rather than sort of being carried out under the behind under the radar, so to speak. So they're being touted as an important component of economic policy. So they become much more self-conscious, and I think that's on the whole is a good thing because they play a role. I think as
build my last tower.
As Robert said, I think there are good arguments for these industrial policies, even in manufacturing. So promoting innovation, promoting supply chain resilience.
I might have to spread them out more. You can't even see.
And especially in the case of the green transition, promoting green industries, I think is extremely important. So I'm also support the IRA.
But anyway.
Which is very expensive in terms of tax incentives, but I think is really a fundamental transformation in the entire political economy of U.S. economic policy with respect to the climate transition. So I think it's extremely.
Regardless. Oh, I'm a fucking bit. Ooh, I got another tower. I can't build it. I'm too broke. I think we're good. Okay. Who's on Twitch? Who can I send you over to on Twitch? Love streaming. Love to guys watch me stream. I will, I guess I can send you to Visora. Or Kanakin. I'll send you to Visora, I think. Love streaming. Love to guys watch me stream. I'll probably stream again tomorrow. We'll probably be talking to Randy. Probably. I'm going to go probably on a walk and probably edit. If I have the motivation to actually edit. We'll see. Who knows? And on YouTube, I think I can send you. I'll send you a P-Skill. I think you might be starting soon still or whatever. But anyway, yeah. Nice shot, India. Fun stream, fun time. See you guys tomorrow, probably. Love you. See you guys tomorrow. Live streaming. Yeah.